My in-laws called me an outsider and hid their millions until grandma's inheritance forced the truth to be out. I, 34F, always thought I had a normal middle-class marriage. My husband and I have been together for 8 years, married for 5. We live in a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs, drive sensible used cars, and both work full-time, me as a teacher and him in accounting. We've always been careful with money, saving where we could while still taking modest vacations once a year and occasionally splurging on nice dinners out. Nothing extravagant, but comfortable enough. That's why what happened 3 months ago turned my entire world upside down and has me questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage and the family I married into. My husband's grandmother passed away. They were fairly close. We visited her a few times a year at her small but tidy apartment in the city. She seemed like a typical grandmother. Made too much food when we visited, kept photos of all her grandchildren on every surface, and always sent us home with leftovers and hand-knit scarves. She lived alone after her husband died about 15 years ago, and while her place was nice, it wasn't anything that screamed wealth to me. The funeral was modest, held at the local church she'd attended for decades. The family gathered afterward at my husband's parents' house, which, like our home, is nice but nothing extravagant. A simple 4-bedroom colonial in an established neighborhood. My in-laws have always lived comfortably but frugally. My father-in-law worked as an engineer before retiring, and my mother-in-law was a nurse. They've never flashed money or talked about being wealthy. 2 weeks after the funeral, we received a call from my father-in-law asking us to come over for dinner. He mentioned they needed to discuss some family business related to the grandmother's estate. I figured perhaps she'd left some keepsakes or a small amount of money to each grandchild. When we arrived, I immediately sensed something was different. My in-laws seemed tense, and my husband's siblings and their spouses were all there too, which was unusual for a weeknight. After an awkward dinner, where everyone seemed to be avoiding a specific topic, my father-in-law cleared his throat and suggested we move to the living room. As you all know, Mom passed away recently, he began, addressing the room but looking primarily at his children. What you don't know is the extent of what she's left behind. He paused, glancing at his wife, who gave him a small nod. Your grandmother, and our family, has significant wealth that we've kept private for generations. The room went completely silent. My husband shifted beside me, and I turned to look at him. His expression was unreadable. How significant? Asked my husband's sister. My father-in-law took a deep breath. The total estate is valued at approximately $47 million. I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. $47 million? From the grandmother who lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper? This doesn't include the family trust, which is separate and remains intact, he continued, as casually as if discussing the weather. I looked around the room, expecting to see shock on everyone's faces. Instead, my husband's siblings were nodding thoughtfully. My husband's face remained impassive, but I could feel him tensing beside me. That's when it hit me. I was the only one who didn't know. You all knew about this? I asked, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. The room fell silent again, uncomfortable glances bouncing between family members. We don't discuss family finances with outsiders, my mother-in-law finally said. Outsiders? I repeated, the word stinging more than I expected. We've been married for 5 years. It's a family rule, my father-in-law explained. Going back generations. We live modestly, we don't display wealth, and we don't discuss finances with anyone who wasn't born into the family. It's how we've preserved our wealth for so long. I looked at my husband, who was now staring at the floor. Did you know all this? I asked him directly. He nodded slowly, not meeting my eyes. I've known since I was 18. Every family member is told when they reach adulthood. And you never thought to mention this to me? Your wife. The mother of your child. Our 2-year-old was home with a babysitter. He finally looked at me, his expression pained. I couldn't. I took an oath. An oath. To hide things from your spouse. My father-in-law interrupted. It's not personal. It's how our family operates. Privacy and discretion have protected us from gold diggers, scammers, and the complications that come with people knowing you have money. I was too stunned to be properly angry yet. So for 8 years, you've all been pretending to be middle class while secretly sitting on millions? We don't pretend, my mother-in-law said firmly. We choose to live modestly. The money is for security and future generations, not for showing off or living extravagantly. I turned back to my husband. All those times we stressed about mortgage payments or debated whether we could afford a vacation. Was that just an act? No, he insisted. I don't have access to the family money for daily expenses. That's not how it works. I live on what I earn, just like I've told you. My father-in-law cleared his throat again. Which brings us to the reason for this meeting. Grandmothers will have specific provisions for each of you. For the next 20 minutes, he outlined how the inheritance would be distributed. Each grandchild would receive a substantial sum outright, plus access to investment accounts with specific conditions. There were properties I'd never heard of, business interests I couldn't have imagined, and trust provisions that made my head spin. Then came the bombshell. For the married grandchildren, my father-in-law continued, there's a special provision. Grandmother was traditional in her values. She believed strongly in the sanctity of marriage and family loyalty. I felt a chill run down my spine. Each spouse of a grandchild must sign an amended post-nuptial agreement acknowledging the family wealth and explicitly waiving any claim to it in the event of divorce. Once signed, the grandchild and their spouse will receive an additional joint gift of $5 million to be used as they see fit. The room was dead silent. If the spouse refuses to sign, the grandchild's inheritance goes into a restricted trust they can never fully control, and there will be no joint gift. I felt all eyes in the room turn to me. The tension was palpable. How long do we have to decide? Asked my husband's cousin's wife. 30 days from today, answered my father-in-law. On the drive home, neither of us spoke for several minutes. My mind was racing, trying to process everything I'd learned. Not just the money itself, but the years of secrecy. The family dinners where they must have been careful not to let anything slip. The holidays, the conversations, all while keeping this massive secret. Were you ever going to tell me? I finally asked. I wasn't allowed to, he replied quietly. The family rules are clear. Only blood relatives can know. So what was the plan? Keep me in the dark forever? What about when our son grows up? Were you going to keep secrets from me about our own child? He gripped the steering wheel tighter. He would have been told when he turned 18, like we all were. And I still wouldn't be allowed to know. Even when our own son knew. I don't make the rules, he said defensively. This system has protected our family wealth for generations. Protected it from people like me, you mean? That's not fair. Fair. I laughed bitterly. You've been lying to me our entire relationship. How is that fair? I haven't lied about anything important, he insisted. Our life together is real. My job, our home, how we live, that's all real. The money doesn't change who I am. But it changes who you trusted me to be, I countered. You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. When we got home, I went straight to the bedroom while he paid the babysitter. I sat on the edge of our bed, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. He came in a few minutes later and sat beside me, keeping some distance between us. I'm sorry, he said softly. I should have found a way to tell you. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. At first, it was because I wasn't supposed to. Later, I guess I was afraid it would change things between us. Change what, exactly? How you saw me. Us. Our life together. He sighed. I grew up watching what happens when people find out you have money. Friends who only want what you can give them. People who treat you differently. Dating gets complicated fast. I loved that you wanted me for me, not for some trust fund. I tried to understand his perspective, but the hurt was still raw. So what happens now? I signed this post-nuptial, and suddenly I'm worthy of being in on the big family secret. It's not about being worthy, he said. It's just how things have always been done. And if I don't sign? He looked pained. Then my inheritance goes into a restricted trust. I'd still receive distributions, but I'd never have full control. And we lose out on $5 million, I added. This isn't about the money. Isn't it, though? Your entire family has been organized around protecting money for generations. To the point of keeping spouses, people who have children with you, in the dark. We talked in circles for hours that night, neither of us fully able to see the other's perspective. I felt betrayed by the secrecy, while he felt trapped between family loyalty and his relationship with me. The next few days were tense. I took time off work, claiming a family emergency, which wasn't far from the truth. I needed space to think without the distraction of 30 kindergartners needing my attention. I called my sister, telling her we were having marriage problems without specifying what they were. Even now, I found myself keeping their secret. She suggested couples counseling, which made me laugh bitterly to myself. How could we possibly explain this situation to a therapist? My husband gave me space but continued trying to explain the family's perspective. How the wealth went back 4 generations, starting with his great-great-grandfather who had built a manufacturing business. How they'd seen other wealthy families torn apart by greed, exploitation, and bad publicity. How living modestly and keeping their wealth private had allowed them to raise children who valued work and weren't spoiled by privilege. I understood the reasoning intellectually, but emotionally, I couldn't get past the breach of trust. A week after the bombshell, I was still struggling when my mother-in-law unexpectedly showed up at our house while my husband was at work. I thought perhaps we could talk woman to woman, she said. I reluctantly invited her in, offering coffee more out of habit than hospitality. I know this has been a shock, she began once we were seated at the kitchen table. And I understand why you feel betrayed. Do you? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've never trusted me from day one. She considered this. It wasn't personal. I went through the same thing when I married into the family. This caught me by surprise. You weren't born into wealth either? She shook her head. I was a nurse at a county hospital when I met my husband. I had student loans and shared an apartment with 2 other nurses. When I found out about the family money, 2 years after we were married, I was furious. I studied her face, looking for signs she was just saying this to relate to me, but she seemed sincere. What happened? I almost left him, she admitted. Packed a bag and everything. I felt like our entire relationship had been built on a lie. This was exactly how I felt, and hearing her say it aloud validated my emotions in a way nothing else had. What made you stay? I asked, genuinely curious. I realized that while he had kept this one thing from me, this big thing, everything else had been real. How he treated me, the life we built together, the person he was day to day. That wasn't fake. She paused. And I had to ask myself, if he'd told me about the money when we first met, would I have believed he loved me for me? Or would I always have wondered if I'd have given him a chance if he hadn't been wealthy? I hadn't considered this perspective before. Would knowing about the money have changed how our relationship developed? Would I have felt comfortable letting him pay for dates? Would I have worried that he thought I was just interested in his wealth? The family has strange ways, she continued. I don't agree with all of them, but I've seen how money changes people, changes relationships. There's wisdom in some of their caution. She reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. For what it's worth, I argued that spouses should be told after the wedding. I lost that argument. After she left, I sat in the quiet house thinking about everything she'd said. I was still hurt, still angry, but I could see glimpses of a perspective beyond my own pain. That evening, when my husband came home, I was ready to talk more calmly. I need to understand exactly what this postnuptial would mean, I said. In plain English, not legal jargon. He seemed relieved at my practical approach. Basically, it acknowledges that you're aware of the family wealth now and that you waive any claim to my inherited assets if we ever divorce. You'd still be entitled to half of everything we build together, everything I earn from my job, and the $5 million gift would be jointly ours, no strings attached. And if I don't sign? Then my inheritance is placed in a trust with restrictions. I'd receive distributions, but never have full control. And we wouldn't receive the joint gift. I thought about this. Would we tell our son about the money when he turns 18, regardless of what I decide about the agreement? He nodded. Yes. That's non-negotiable in the family. And if we have more children? The same rules would apply to them. I took a deep breath. I need more time to think. The next 3 weeks were a strange mix of intense discussions, legal consultations, and deep personal reflection. I insisted on reading the family history, understanding exactly how the wealth was structured and managed, and learning about the charitable foundations the family quietly supported. What struck me most was how the family used their wealth, not for lavish lifestyles or status symbols, but for security, education, and carefully selected philanthropic efforts. There was a remarkable lack of entitlement in how they approached their privilege. Still, the secrecy bothered me deeply. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been deemed untrustworthy from the start. 2 days before the deadline, I made my decision. I asked my husband to gather his immediate family, parents and siblings only, at our home. When they arrived, looking apprehensive, I invited them to sit in our living room. Thank you for coming, I began. I've given this situation a lot of thought. I understand the family's desire for privacy and protection. I even respect many aspects of how you've managed wealth across generations. They watched me carefully, no one interrupting. But I can't accept being kept in the dark about such a fundamental aspect of the family I married into. If I'm going to be part of this family, truly part of it, then I need to be trusted, not treated as an outsider. My mother-in-law started to speak, but I raised my hand gently. I'm willing to sign the post-nuptial agreement on one condition, I continued. That the family rules change going forward. Spouses should be told about the family wealth after marriage, not kept in the dark indefinitely. They should be brought into the fold, bound by the same expectations of discretion that you all observe, but not excluded from the truth. The room was silent for a moment. That would be a significant change to how we've operated for generations, my father-in-law finally said. Yes, I agreed. But families evolve. Traditions change. And trust has to go both ways. What followed was 3 hours of intense discussion. My husband, to his credit, supported my position completely. His sister surprisingly became my strongest ally, admitting she'd been uncomfortable keeping secrets from her own spouse. My brother-in-law revealed he'd almost told his wife countless times over their 12-year marriage. In the end, we reached a compromise. New spouses would be told about the family wealth after 3 years of marriage, following a formal induction into the family's philosophy of wealth management and discretion. Not ideal from my perspective, but a significant shift from never. I signed the post-nuptial agreement the next day, with the family's written commitment to the new policy attached as an addendum. The $5 million gift was transferred to a joint account a week later. We immediately donated $1 million to establish a scholarship fund at the local community college, where my husband and I first met in a literature class. The rest we put aside, continuing to live on our regular incomes, while we thoughtfully considered how this windfall could best serve our family's future and the community around us. 3 months later, our life looks remarkably similar on the surface. I still teach kindergarten. My husband still works in accounting. We still live in the same house and drive the same cars. We still budget for groceries and household expenses. But everything has changed beneath the surface. I now attend the quarterly family meetings where investment strategies and charitable giving are discussed. I'm learning about financial management at a level I never imagined. And I'm developing a deeper understanding of the complex relationship my husband's family has with their wealth, the privilege they acknowledge, and the responsibility they feel towards stewarding resources across generations. The trust between my husband and me is slowly rebuilding. There are still moments when I wonder what else might have been kept from me, but they're becoming less frequent. We're seeing a counselor who specializes in family wealth dynamics, which has helped us navigate this new territory together. Perhaps the most profound change is in how I view money itself. Growing up in a working-class family, I saw money primarily as something you earned and spent, a means of survival with occasional small luxuries. Now I'm learning to see it also as a tool for impact, a responsibility to manage wisely, and a privilege that should never define one's worth or identity. As for my husband's grandmother's shocking condition, in a strange way, I'm grateful for it. Without that catalyst, I might have spent decades as an outsider in my own family, never fully knowing the people I love. Sometimes it takes a disruption to create a better path forward, not just for yourself, but for generations to come.